welcome back to those of you who've rejoined us. And I'm delighted to see David Pearson here. I've heard David speak on more than one occasion. And don't tell him, but there's a couple of things he showed on the slide and I thought, oh, I've got to be sharing this with networks. So David, I have been sharing some of your stuff and telling them this is from KPMG. Was it Breathe? Was that the name of your network? There you go, the Breathe network at KPMG. So I have been citing your work because it's just so practical and easy for people to apply. But this session, people, is really about executive engagement. I cannot tell you the number of times where I'm asked the question, how do we get senior people involved? How do we get their commitment? Well, this session is going to cover those questions and more. And the focus is about acquiring executive support and embedding your network in the wider business culture and structure. David, welcome. Are you ready?
I am. Thank you, Sharon, and for a lovely introduction there. And thanks, Kieran, and the whole team at Dods. It's always a pleasure to take part in these sessions, and it's a real privilege to be invited to talk to you today. You can see my Twitter handle, I think handle's the right word, isn't it, on the top of every slide of the pack I'm about to share. And you can also hunt me down on LinkedIn, so do that. I'm delighted to be with you and really looking forward to exploring how we can drive greater inclusion. As Sharon mentioned, our topic today is executive engagement, acquiring executive support and embedding your network in the wider business and culture and structure. So I'm going to share my screen now. So I do apologize in advance that it's going to be slightly death by poll questions today, as Sharon mentioned, because I've got 8 of them, but they're going to be spread throughout the session and they're going to be in pairs. So that part of it shouldn't be too painful, but just as a jog, if you're able to pull your smartphone out now and access that link to the poll question platform, that would be really helpful. So I've just popped a slide up here, which tells you a bit about me, but frankly, you've already got this, or we should have it in my biography for this session, and it's going to be in this pack, which you're going to receive after today's event. So with your permission, I'll skip over this now, and we'll get into the details of what we're going to explore together in this session. So we're going to look at making the business case and value proposition of your network. We'll look at developing a budget and making a funding bid. We'll explore that tricky question that Sharon flagged there around engaging senior management as sponsors and champions, and then defining guidelines and operating agreements with senior management. So they're the 4 areas we're going to explore today. We'll start off with making the business case and the value proposition of your network. And as I promised, we've got 4 sets of pairs of poll questions. So we're going to, I think Kieran's going to bring up the first set of poll questions now. So this poll question is asking you, and by the way, all responses to this are confidential. It's anonymous. We can't see who's saying what and voting on what. So feel free to vote it's in safety. But this question is I understand how to develop a business case for a staff network. This is based on your personal level of understanding. And I'll leave it to Kieran. Once you're satisfied that we've got enough responses, then I'll ask you to display the poll results, the finished results. That would be great.
Yep, poll's closed.
Awesome, thank you. So as you can see from this poll, about 1/3 of people have said, I understand this a bit, and 1/3 have said, it's not something I understand much, and just a bit over 10% have a great understanding, about 10% have a reasonable understanding, and about 10% it's not really something I've thought about. So it's a really interesting mix, isn't there? If we go on to the next question, and I think what I'm taking from that first poll is that you're all going to get something out of this session, I think. So this one is then understanding how to demonstrate the value of staff networks to senior executives and others. So how great is your understanding of how to demonstrate the value? Because that's one of the key things we're going to explore today is how do you demonstrate that value? And it's no secret that the more you can demonstrate the value of something, the more valuable people will see it to be. Yeah, it's pretty self-evident, isn't it? And yet many of us sort of go through life thinking that staff networks are just an automatically assumed thing, that they're relevant for us, but we don't really think about it in terms of how do we prove that to others, how do we show their value. So when you're ready, I can see you've closed the voting there. We've got the results, and again, we can see about a third of people understand this a bit under 30% have a reasonable understanding, and then about a quarter say it's not something I understand much. 10% have a great understanding, and then 5% say it's something I've not really thought about. So thank you for that, Kieran. If you wouldn't mind closing your screen, and we'll go back to my screen share to pick up where we left off. So thank you for participating in those polls. And as I said, I promise it's all very confidential, so no one's going to come and hunt you down for what you said. So where I thought we could kick things off is what I call resolving the network paradox. So I'd like you to imagine this. You're a newly appointed HR professional, and your manager says, I'd like you to come and speak to me. I've got to discuss a tricky issue with you. And what your manager says is this: some of our staff networks are pushing hard for us to do lots of diversity and inclusion things, but we are getting resistance from our other colleagues. Basically, they think we're going over the top with the networks. And there have been particular complaints about things like the women's network pushing for more women to be promoted, the LGBT network pushing for gender neutral toilets and for celebrating Bi-Visibility Day, and too much discussion on things like people's pronouns. The ethnicity networks all want to celebrate different history months and special days, and it's getting people annoyed. We may need to tone all of this down a bit, or we risk alienating the majority of our employees. And our networks cost us a lot of money and effort, and the executives have started questioning what value the networks bring. What do you do? Now, feel free to pop any comments you've got in the chat box around how you would handle that scenario. And while you're doing that, I'll just share some thinking I have around this, which is, I think you've encountered what could be called the network paradox. Because on the one hand, networks seemed to operate by setting people apart as different, yeah? And that can kind of disconnect those people from the rest of the organization and its aims. And in some cases, it can create resentment from the majority of employees who don't identify with that particular group. But on the other hand, staff networks can provide a sense of belonging that encourages employees to remain with an organization and to flourish and to grow. And so the more you emphasize a person or community's distinctive attributes, you know, the particular things that make them special, and the more you raise awareness of them through networks, the more you tend to reduce those people or those communities down to that limited set of characteristics, which can erase the fullness and richness of those individuals and communities. And you'll know that that's happening in your organization when you hear people say things like, I don't want to join the LGBT network because I hate being known as the gay manager. Or I don't want to be promoted just because I'm a woman, so I avoid going to the women's networks events. But on the other hand, the more you minimize those differences, the more you erase the uniqueness of those people and groups, you risk trivializing the barriers that people from diverse backgrounds face. And you'll know that that's happening when your organization, when you hear people say things like, well, I don't care what a person's sexuality is, I treat everyone the same. Or I'm glad we operate as a meritocracy here. After all, your gender or ethnicity has nothing to do with being good at your job. Those are true statements, but unfortunately, they're usually made in the context of saying, I don't want to know anything about your unique and special characteristics. I don't care about your race. It's not important to me. And that's not really something that someone wants to hear, is it? That a vital part of your identity is unimportant to them. So either way, you risk ending up with disgruntled employees. It's either going to be the majority or the minority who are upset. So how do you get it right? How do we demonstrate to executives what it is that staff networks bring, given this paradox? Well, there's lots of possibilities, and I don't have time today to go into all of the ways you can tackle this, but the quick answer is raising awareness to your stakeholders that these things are not mutually exclusive. and they don't automatically disadvantage one group over another. And we can kind of understand this better if we look at this simplified identity matrix that you can see on the screen, because here you can see that resolving the paradox is about flexing the organization's response to the things that make people in staff networks unique because of their diversity and as individuals, and the things they have in common with others because of their diversity and because they're individuals. In other words, in simplified language, if you're a member of a network, you've got stuff in common with the other people in the network, but you also have stuff in common with all the other people in the organization who are not part of that group. So this allows diverse colleagues to be situated more fully in their complex identities with, for example, reference to being from a minority community while also having the characteristics of a human being. Now, some of those characteristics themselves might involve particular challenges arising from ethnicity or age or disability and so on. And this is a really simplified matrix. I mean, a more complex one would recognize those multiple axes, wouldn't it? It would take into account the multiple dimensions. So my questions for you are this: where do you see yourself on this matrix? Or if you're not in any staff network yourself, where do you think your colleagues see themselves? Where do you think your organization places its focus? Is it on particular quadrants or is it on a single quadrant? Is it somewhere in the middle of this matrix? Does the focus shift over time? Or is this something that your organization pays no attention to whatsoever? Resolving this paradox requires radical transformation to change the way every stakeholder views the paradox. And you've got to use multiple approaches, and you have to keep reiterating and experimenting. You need everything in your toolbox because there's no single thing or set of interventions that's going to help you resolve this paradox on its own. And sadly, I'm afraid you can't just copy what others are doing, because although they might be very successful, every organization has its own culture and ecosystems. So benchmarking and imitation of others on its own is not the answer, unfortunately. And you've therefore got to launch a bit into uncharted territory and just recognize that there are trade-offs, there are risks, and you're going to proceed regardless. You're going to experiment. You accept that you may not get it right, but you be open about the chances of failure and the need to persist. This is a very different model of transformation from what you might be used to in the context of staff networks and embedding yourself in the culture of an organization, because it doesn't treat this exercise as a kind of program or a project. Instead, it's almost like a training to do a sport or a calling or a vocation. Yeah, it's more like being an artist. Now, all of this is very theoretical, so I think we could look at some concrete examples of where things go wrong for networks. And two of the big topics of executive support and embedding networks in the business fit in all of this in order to resolve the paradox. So let's have a look at where things go wrong with networks. Not meeting the needs of employees. Sometimes networks are designed in a vacuum by HR and no one bothers to talk to the actual people who are affected most. They may not be aligned with the objectives of the organization, and we'll talk more about that later. They may not be fully inclusive. How many networks actually recognize that people have more than one identity? Yeah. So, you know, your LGBT network that's not racially inclusive. They may have a poor balance between what they focus on internally versus externally. There may be no succession planning. I mean, that's really common. No one delegates and no one has a clue who's going to step up next when the leaders take a rest. Not supported by executives. We're going to explore that one more. They're not supported at junior levels. You know, they're kind of been created by people at the higher level who are not in touch with what matters to people down at lower levels in the organization. And lastly, value added isn't shown or documented. And again, we're going to talk a bit about that, and we kind of already have. Now, you will get this slide in the pack, so don't panic if you think lots of interesting things are in it and you can't take it all in, but I'm circling those two big bits that are really what we're going to focus on in today's session. So I'm going to let you in on a secret. The best way to demonstrate value is to be a chameleon. Now, why am I showing you a chameleon? Does anyone have any idea why I would be showing a chameleon? Like, this just seems really bizarre. And I love the comment there from Amanda. the paradox quadrants are really interesting to reflect on where my organization is. We're definitely in cultural change based upon the need for inclusion. Interesting to think about the commonalities in this way. So that's great. Thank you, Amanda. So the reason I'm showing you a chameleon is simply this. The fastest way to demonstrate the value proposition of your network and to make the business case is to align yourself with the organization's existing value proposition and business case. The fastest way is simply to align yourself with what is already there. They've done all the work for you. So if you just imitate this, you can then, as a chameleon, blend into your background and become part of it. So where do you find those things? Do you know where in your organization you can find its value proposition? Do you know where in your organization you can find its business case or its business strategy? Yeah. Now, while you're thinking about that, and again, if you want to pop in the chat box any feedback you have around where you would find in your organization its value proposition and its business case, I'll show you a real life example. So what you're seeing here, and by the way, again, you get this in the pack, but here are a firm's strategy documents, and they've been adapted by the LGBT network that I used to lead that Sharon mentioned, the Breathe network. And we literally copied the fonts, the sizes, and the colors of the firm's business strategy. We rewrote the words to be relevant to the network, but they were anchored in those of the firm. So you can see the purpose, values, vision, etc. You can set out also, there we set out how we live our values, and they were aligned to the firm's values. And you can also see we created a code of conduct for the network. So what do you think happened when we showed this document to senior executives? Well, they immediately recognized it as being aligned to the firm's strategy. Yeah, and the beauty of this is that you don't have to start from scratch. You can simply piggyback on the firm's existing materials because they've done most of the work for you. Hence the idea of the chameleon. So that's the first topic we were going to cover today. We're going to move on to the next one, which is developing a budget and making a funding bid. And we're about to do some more poll questions. So the third question now is, I understand the role of the network structure in developing a budget and making a funding bid. And I'm deliberately not going to go much further on that point or explain what I mean there in that question. I'm simply going to test where you're at on that one. So I understand the role of the network structure. What on earth's the network structure got to do with a budget and a funding bid? Doesn't seem relevant, does it? We'll find out in a minute, hopefully. And Kieran, when you're satisfied that as the electoral officer that we've got enough votes, you can close them as you have done, and there's the results. So we can see this one's quite a different result, isn't it, from the previous ones, because getting up to close to 2/3 of people say it's not something I understand much. About 15% think it's something they understand a bit. 10% of you almost have a great understanding of this, 10% a reasonable understanding, and then just under 5 is not something I've really thought about. So I think this is rich ground to explore, isn't it? And Kieran, if you wouldn't mind bringing up poll question 4, then we'll go on to that one. A reminder, these are all anonymous, so vote away with confidence. So this one says, I understand the role of the network business model in developing a budget and making a funding bid. So the network business model. Now, is that something you've thought about? Have you ever thought of your networks as having a business model? Seems a bit weird, doesn't it? What on earth's a business model got to do with the budget, particularly in a network context? I didn't know that networks had a business model. Apparently they do. So we're going to find that out in a moment. And again, Kieran, once you're ready, you can close off that poll and we'll have a look at the results. So what we see in this one is that 46%, so a bit under half, have said it's not something I've really thought about. A third, it's not something I understand much. And then about 15% say I understand this a bit, and a bit under 5 say, yes, I have a great understanding. And no one's gone for reasonable understanding on that one. So again, thank you for those, Kieran. I'll go back to screen share on my side, but interesting to see there the results of those polls, again showing kind of room to explore, isn't there? So picking up on that point, let's take a look and see why I bothered asking those rather strange questions. So the first thing to note is you want to create a budget, yeah, that's the aim. So you have a network. If you're fortunate enough to get any budget, and I know that if you're in the public sector, that might be something you've yet to experience, or you may have a tiny budget, but that's fine. I'll explain a bit more about how the public sector can leverage. So you've got your budget. Where do you begin? Well, network structure. So my proposition to you is that one of the places you can start is to look at the structure of the network in order to understand how to get to a budget. But I'm going to explain that in a second. The other element that I think is important is, and I mentioned this, is the business model. And you might think, I don't even think our network has a business model, but you can get one. It's not difficult, and I'll show you again in a moment. You put those together and you've got a business plan, and that's the thing that you then launch from to ask for your budget. So let's take each of those in turn. So again, I'm drawing on a real life example of the Breathe network. And I know that this is a more complex structure than many of you are used to seeing in a network, where typically you might have co-chairs, maybe a treasurer if you're lucky, maybe a secretary or something like that, and probably that's about it. And then after that, it's just like whoever turns up on the day. So I get that. You don't need to have this level of structure, but this is showing you the kind of Rolls-Royce version. But the reason it's relevant is because driven out of this structure is a direct link to the business model of the network, and from that, a direct link to the business plan, and from that, a direct link to the budget. By the way, I'm just sharing one thing with you is, remember I mentioned succession planning and the lack of that in most networks. If you look at the bottom of the screen, you can see how our succession planning worked for that network, from volunteer through to co-chair through to advisory board member. So have a look at these circles here. We had this structure that included a core executive, but around that was this thing called Breathe in the Workplace, Breathe in the Marketplace, and Breathe in the Community. And I'll show you on the next slide what that actually translated into. But basically, we divided ourselves up into those three areas or spheres of influence. And those are the thing that drove the core of our business model. So there's network structure leading into business model. In your context, it might be something really simple. It could just simply be that you have a couple of co-chairs and that you just have a unified structure. Yeah, you don't break it up into different spheres of influence. You may have a single sphere of influence. That's fine. You can work with any structure you have. The key thing is to tie your structure to your model. So let's have a look at our model. Here is the business model. What it shows is that there are three core programs for each sphere of influence that I mentioned. Breathe in the Workplace, Breathe in the Marketplace, Breathe in the Community. What is Breathe in the Workplace? That's all the stuff that we do for our members and for our colleagues. What's Breathe in the Marketplace? That's what we do for and with our clients and our suppliers. And I think you get the idea. Breathe in the Community is what we do for and with our communities, charities, and NGOs. Does anything strike you in this? Can you see the structure now reflected in the model? And everything that's driven down below that appears in the business model. So under Breathe in the Workplace, for example, we had a mentoring program, we had role model training, we had the work we did around policy development, we had the Breathe Executive itself, so our own internal development. We had events with other networks and so on, yeah? Breathe in the Marketplace, getting involved with clients, external networks and so on, and then Breathe in the Community included things like our Charity of the Year, our community partnerships. So how does the business model then translate into the business plan and ultimately the budget? I've had to redact this slide because it's got pound signs in, although these are from a couple of years ago, and some names. So I've whited out certain bits of it. But the main thing is not to understand the detail, it's to understand the structure. And again, you can see on the left here, we've got this kind of link to our colleagues, link to our clients, and link to our communities. And those three things permeate that business plan. So we describe there the kind of activities we undertake in relation to each of those three spheres of influence or activity. And then over in the whited out bit is where the pound signs go, yeah, which is our bid for funding, where we're asking for money and from multiple sources. So it includes not only central funding, but any other sources that we can obtain. And that's an important point I want to pick up in a second. So basically what you've seen here is a movement from the structure of the network into the business model of the network, how we go about doing what we do, reflected in a business plan that sets out in detail all the stuff we're going to do in the following year. In fact, for us, we used to plan 3 years ahead. There's a clue. If you want to get to the front of the curve, look out more than 1 year ahead. And then from that, we derived the budget. What about forgotten sources of funding, though? So depending where you're located, what organization you're in, the business itself is a great place to go sometimes, yeah? Or even external partners. And I know in the public sector, this can be a challenge. Like, who are you going to go to within your public sector organization to ask for more money if your network hasn't been given very much? But you might want to think about partnering with the private sector. Why don't you contact someone in an area related to what you do in your public sector organization and say, hey, could we partner with you on events? You know, you pay for the drinks, we'll help provide speakers and do some of the legwork. You pay for the drinks and food or whatever, something like that, yeah? Then you've got other networks. So if you've got multiple networks in your organization, why don't you propose that a proportion of your budget as a network be spent on joint initiatives? And that way you can basically accelerate the amount of initiatives you can do, but you can also grow the size of the pot for running those events and initiatives. And lastly, you could avoid the need for budget altogether. You know, there are some activities that don't require much funding. And if you've got people available but no money, then why not harness those people and use them? Now, through a combination of these three things, when I was running our network, we probably grew our budget pot by 200% or more through these other sources of funding, yeah? And so I've used them in anger. I've used all three of these things in real life. Now, I know that your organization might provide very little funding and therefore your budget might be very, very simple. It may look nothing like the spreadsheet snapshot that I showed you, and that's fine. You can scale this up and down according to the needs of your particular circumstances, but it's the principles that are important, isn't it? The idea that you don't just rock up to someone and say, I need money. That doesn't give them much to go on, does it? But if you come with the credibility of saying, okay, we've looked at our network structure, we understand that we have a very simple business model, and we've used that business model to create a plan for what we're going to do in the year ahead and the costs that are involved in that. And we've thought about where we can get the funding from other sources and also where we can avoid funding it altogether and just use the labor available from people who are willing to volunteer. Then you're more likely to get engagement, aren't you? Because you've shown that you've been intelligent about it, you've shown that you've been thoughtful about it, and you've shown that you've been creative about it. And I think those things get you a long way to getting a better reception than merely rocking up and saying, we think we need to do 6 things and it's going to cost this much. Can you give us the money? Now, hopefully that's helpful. I'm going to move on now to our third area, which is around engaging senior management as sponsors and champions. And again, poll questions are about to be brought up by Kieran, but this is a really interesting topic. I know Sharon will be on the edge of her seat waiting for this one because it's all about that. How on earth do you connect to those senior people of influence, and how do you get them interested in what you're doing? Because many of us involved in networks are very passionate, but it can be lonely sometimes, can't it? So I'm starting off with a rather odd question here. Do you consider yourself a leader? And again, you might be thinking, why on earth would you be asking that? What's that got to do with engaging senior executives? Do you consider yourself a leader? And thank you, by the way, for everyone who's happily switching mode to jump on their smartphone and then look back at the screen. I know it can be a bit distracting, but it's really valuable to get this feedback. By the way, when you receive these slides, and thanks, Kieran, for closing out the voting, when you receive these slides, you will get the actual results of these polls in them. I'll make sure I include those. So in answer to this, we've got not quite half saying that to some degree, I consider myself a leader, just under a third saying yes, a bit over 15% saying not really, 5% of you almost think not at all, and then 5% not quite sure. It depends, probably depends what you mean by a leader, I think is where you might be heading there. But it's interesting to see less than a third of you consider yourself a leader. Now, I'm just going to pause here for a second, Kieran, so I haven't forgotten that we've got one more poll question to come, but I want to address this question right here and now, because I think it's a really important one, and it might be something you've never thought about. Because I imagine some of you are sitting there thinking, well, what's this question got to do with acquiring executive support and embedding your network in the wider business culture and structure? Well, evidence suggests that people are drawn to people who are more similar to them rather than less similar. As human beings, we feel more comfortable approaching someone who is sort of like us. You know, people we think we have something in common with. And you can imagine you're a really keen tennis player, and you're in a room or on a train carriage or something with 10 other people you know nothing about. And it comes to your attention that another one of those people plays tennis. Maybe they're wearing tennis gear, I don't know. Who do you think you're probably going to go up to and start speaking to, all other things being equal? It could well be that person, couldn't it? Because you've got something in common to talk about. So that makes sense. Nevertheless, it might be a somewhat dismal fact, and it might make some of us feel that there's actually something wrong with our organizations. But executives are hardwired the same way as the rest of us. Yeah, just like us. If they are approached by someone they feel is more like them, they will statistically be more likely to be uncomfortable engaging with them. So if you approach a leader and you give off the vibe of being a leader yourself, they will sort of tune in to that part of you that says, I'm a leader too, just like you. And they will feel a kind of affinity with that. We know this from just neurology and the way that we operate as humans. Now, we may feel like and wish that that weren't the case, yeah? But I'm afraid that's how the world is. Very few leaders have learned how to overcome this hardwired affinity bias. But the great news is that you can use it to your advantage. So if you choose to regard yourself as a leader, the chances are that other leaders will also regard you as a leader, and they're more likely to pay attention to you. And it doesn't matter what grade you are in an organization, because leaders recognize leaders at all levels, yeah? And they'll tune in to that part of you and that says and that shows I'm a leader. And that improves the chances of you getting engagement with and support from an executive. And that's why I asked the question, do you consider yourself a leader? So for those of you who didn't put the yes, right, the 70% who were not in the yes box, the good news is you can very easily change that by simply considering yourself a leader. You don't even particularly need to be skilled initially as a leader. Just the mindset shift and presenting yourself as a leader will get you down the right track. Yeah. Later on, you can build up the skills and the confidence around being a leader in reality, if you like. You've heard this phrase, fake it till you make it. So come to a leader full of confidence, recognizing your role within the network, or if you're supporting networks from perhaps your HR function or whatever, then you are a leader. So Kieran, if we could do the next poll before we move on. I hope that all made sense, by the way. Some of you are probably panicking now and thinking, but I'm not a leader, so I don't have any hope. That's not how it works. You'll be fine. So this one is, when it comes to staff networks, I understand what issues to engage everyone on. To engage executives on. Yeah, when it comes to staff networks, I understand what issues to engage executives on, because there's a bunch of stuff you could engage executives on, isn't there? There's all sorts of things that networks get involved in. Some wise, some perhaps not so wise, some successful, some not very successful. And of course, when you come to an executive, do you just bring everything to them? Do you bring the kitchen sink and just go, here's my mess, can you help me fix it? Or are you more selective and thoughtful about what you bring? So again, Kieran, when you're satisfied that the voting's in, we will close the poll. And there it is. So here are our results for this poll. This shows that more than a third of you have a reasonable understanding. That's a great place to build from. Nearly a third understand this a bit. 15% are in the yes, I have a great understanding, and 15% don't really understand this much. So that's great. Thank you, Kieran, for those. Again, I'll go back to screen share. So we've had our polls on that one. And just to remind you where we're at this point is we're on topic 3 of 4, engaging senior management as sponsors and champions. So how am I going to unpack this? Well, I thought the first thing to do would be to have a bit of fun. Yeah, the world is often full of really bad news and everything seems very negative. But if you just indulge me for a moment, I'll share something with you that might give you a laugh. So here's what we often come to our executives and say when it comes to engagement. We go, okay, here's a list of critical network activities that require resourcing. So, you turn up to your executive and you put this big list in front of them. And when you say that to them, what they might actually be hearing is this: you want money. Yeah. And their immediate thought when you basically go to them and say, we want money, is there isn't any money. Or you might turn up to an executive and say, we'd like you to make a visible commitment to inclusion. Yeah, that happens, doesn't it? We go to them and we say, we'd like a visible commitment from you. And what they hear you saying is, you want me to make a pledge. And then their thought is, can I get my PA to find last year's so that we can just use it again? Save me writing a new pledge. Or you might say, we'd like to raise your profile on inclusion. And what they hear you saying is, you want me to make a video. So not just a pledge, but a video this time. And of course, can we reuse one we've already made before? And then the last one is this is a beauty. Our network has won an award. So you go to your executive and you say that. Their immediate thought, you want me to pay for a table at the awards dinner? Well, perhaps in pre-COVID time. And of course, then they're thinking, could I write that off under marketing? So, I mean, that's a bit of fun, but it's important to realize that some models of sponsorship are more of a partnership or a collaboration, and others are more transactional. So when you're engaging with sponsors in your firm for your networks, think about whether it's a partnership with them. Is it a collaborative effort, or is it more of a transactional one? Because this will determine how you engage your sponsor and what you engage them on. And you need to develop a profound understanding of what to engage executives on and what not to engage them on, which leads us into some practical tips for you around these topics. So first thing I would say is to consider substitutes. Yeah, make sure that the issues you bring to your executives are meaty, that they're well defined, and they're brief. Executives are typically really busy. They're short on time. So they haven't got time to sit there and listen to you describe in great detail for half an hour a very simple issue. Always engaging on a transactional level can create resentment. So think about how you can engage with executives in a way that isn't purely transactional. In other words, not always just going to them to seek help or money, but instead engaging with them to share good news or ask their opinion or invite them to something that is enjoyable. Yeah. Try to be reciprocal. So offer training, offer opportunities to engage with individuals, or to make a major and lasting contribution, something that they could put their name to, something they could leave as a legacy. I mean, you can appeal to the vanity of senior leaders. We want to create this program and we want this to be the thing that you're remembered by because you sponsored it. Yeah, does that make sense? Then it's really important to know what it is that you want to expect from senior executives and sponsors. Avoiding the common trap of asking or appointing a sponsor without them or without you really knowing what it is that they're expected to do. This happens so commonly. Are they meant to be an advocate for the network? Are they meant to be the public face of inclusion in your organization? Are they a hands-on advisor? Or are they expected to actively participate in events? Are they going to lead from the front or from the side or from behind, from the side? Another one is executive agrees to be a sponsor, and then you hear this complaint from the network that, the sponsor never does anything. Now, meanwhile, from the sponsor's point of view, they are never asked to do anything. So don't wait for your sponsor to offer. Be proactive. They're waiting for you to ask them. Bring concrete requests to them. I get this really commonly. People, I've had so many sponsors come and say to me, look, the network's great. They're doing some really good stuff, but I don't know what they want me to do. They never ask me. They just expect me to know somehow. And then I've already talked a bit about demonstrating value, haven't I? Make sure you demonstrate value to your sponsor, the value of what the network is doing for the organization, because this in turn is of value to your sponsor, because they're also looking to improve their profile. Yeah, they're competing against the other executives in the firm and they want their profile and their performance to stand out. So ask your sponsor what they want and are they getting it? If you give them regular but very brief reporting, it could be just a newsletter, it could be an event dashboard, it could be an annual report, it could be facts and figures, it could be just a short update. But if you give them something to let them know what's going on, then they can stay in tune with what's happening and understand the kind of value you bring. So here's a question for you. What do executives love more than anything? And I would really like to see your answers in the chat box for this one, because it's a great question, isn't it? What do executives love more than anything? If anyone writes things like chocolate or, I don't know, overseas holidays, I'll laugh, but it's not quite what I was looking for. Some executives probably don't like chocolate. And let's have a look at some of the responses. A straightforward win. Looking good, yeah. The answer, thanks, Amanda. I'll come back to you on that one, Amanda. I think you're getting really close to where I'm heading. Impact of their activities, yeah, visible impact. They're looking for solutions. Okay, now Karen, have you seen my slide pack? Did you cheat and look at my? Did you look at my slide pack? Because you'll see why in a second. Sarah says increase institutional and organizational reputation. Yeah, absolutely. Angela, value for money. Yeah, absolutely. So lots of great suggestions, and I would agree with all of those. I think they're all correct, that executives do love those things for sure. But I am going to give the chocolate bar to Karen for this one, because in this context, although there are lots of things that executives love, they definitely love you to solve problems for them, yeah, provide them with solutions, so that you can deal with tricky issues for them so that they don't have to. That's what they love. Now, experience suggests that most executives think that the issues around diversity, inclusion, belonging, culture within organizations are tricky. That's what most executives think about those topics. They think that they're tricky and difficult, yeah? And they are amongst the things that keep executives awake at night. So if you can help solve the diversity and inclusion problem, then executives will seek you out, they will enable you, they will fund you, and they will reward you. Now, for some people, it doesn't feel right for diversity and inclusion to be regarded as a kind of problem to be fixed, yeah? These things are considered fundamental, right? They're fundamental to equality, and they're the right thing to do, or at least they're essential to business competition. Now, all of that might be true, but it still doesn't mean that they aren't a problem for senior executives to solve. So they are both fundamental things that we should be doing for the right reasons. They are essential to business, but they are also a problem. Yeah, they're all of those things. So it's important to understand that, unless you happen to think that your organization has got diversity and inclusion perfect, then there is always a form of problem to be addressed. So it's important to consider what it is that you could or should engage executives on. It can also be helpful to recognize that most executives are not incentivized to behave inclusively or to support our network's inclusion priorities. But recognizing that doesn't make those bad people. It's just they've got other priorities to work on. So looking for ways to make it easy for executives to act inclusively and provide support to networks through various methods is really important.
Sorry to interrupt you, David. We've got 15 minutes left, and I would love to make sure we've got time for some questions, of which I'm sure there's a few. So
absolutely, thank you, Sharon. No, I'm aware, and the last section's quite quick, and I've also picked up there's a couple of questions already in the chat. So just to finalise today's session, our last section is around defining guidelines and operating agreements with senior management. Part of this will be homework for you, but before we do that, we'll have our last set of poll questions, and I'll share a couple of thoughts with you, and then we'll move to the Q&A. So if you wouldn't mind just bringing up, thanks Kieran, the last two polls. So this poll is, I know how to manage the perception by some executives that staff networks are not relevant to the business. Have you ever come across an executive who has that view, kind of like, I know we have networks, but they're a bit of a waste of time and they're not relevant to what we do as a business or what we do as an organization. Do you know how to manage that perception? So that's the poll question we're exploring now. And as soon as Kieran's happy with responses, we'll close that out and have a look at the results. There we go. So the results of this one are about a bit under half say that it's not something I know how to do very well. About a quarter, I know how to do this a bit, and then about 13% of reasonable knowledge, and less than 10% of great knowledge. And for some of you, it's not even something you've thought about yet. So again, be useful to look at what's coming next. And if we go to the next poll, please, Kieran. What I'm going to do is provide you as well with 2 case studies at the end of this materials that you can read in your own time. So this is the last question. What's the one thing that staff networks could make the biggest contribution to in the workplace? What's the one thing that staff networks could make the biggest contribution to in the workplace? You've got a range of options there around best practice, a true sense of love and belonging, psychological safety, pastoral support, or training and education. And I know some of you will be saying, well, it's all of those, or it's a combination, and you'll be wanting to do a multiple vote. But I'm being a bit nasty and forcing you to choose. And again, once Kieran's happy with responses, we'll close that out. So there's 2 case studies that you're going to get in your materials when they're circulated that go into quite a bit of detail around what I did, at least with a network, in embedding it within the culture of the firm and how I engaged with senior executives. So you'll be able to look at that yourself. Okay, so the votes have closed out, and what we've got here is a tie for best practice processes and policies and a true sense of love and belonging. So it's interesting. And then about 15% on pastoral support and psychological safety. Interestingly, no one's gone for training or education there. So that's a really interesting result. Thank you all for that. I want you to just think about what value, and Kieran, if you could close out the poll, that'd be great. Just want you to think about what value your networks can bring. So for this last bit, I'm just going to talk very briefly about defining guidelines and operating agreements with senior management. And in a way, it picks up what we've just talked about on all of the previous topics, the importance of clarity of expectations with your stakeholders and being clear what your network will do and what it won't do. Thinking about your objectives carefully and how you word them, because if you choose poorly worded objectives for your network, you might end up signing up for something more than you intended. And then we'll look really briefly at the culture of continuous feedback. So in order to kind of understand how to create agreements around what you'll do and what you won't do, it's really helpful to do some basic stakeholder management. And here's a stakeholder map. You can find these on the internet very easily. I'm sure many of you have seen these before. You may have even created one before. Have you actually then gone on to use it? Or did you just make a nice map and then forget all about it? So this helps you understand how best to work with senior management, but also with the people who are the gateway to those people, yeah? So your key network sponsors can both help you make a stakeholder map, but also they should be in it themselves. And then I want to talk briefly about the expectation trap, which is where you have these false expectations set up for your stakeholders, and particularly your senior stakeholders, about what you will or won't do as a network. And I'm going to illustrate these with some real life actual examples that have been taken from network business plans. These are the objectives that some of these networks set out. So I'd like you to look at these and think to yourself, what is problematic about these statements? From an ethnicity network, they said one of their objectives was to make sure targets for ethnic diversity of our leaders are reached. Now, you might think none of these statements are problematic and they're all fine, but I would just ask you this. Is this ethnicity network in a position to ensure diversity targets are reached? Yeah, does it have the resources, the expertise, and the time to undertake all the work required for the organization as a whole to reach those targets? From an LGBT network, their objective was to update policies and ensure they're LGBT inclusive, which is a lovely objective to have. But again, I'd ask, is the network best placed to update the policies itself, or is its role to advise the D&I team or the HR team to update? Yeah, so it's a subtle difference between the network updating the policy and the network advising the people responsible to update them. We had a gender network that said to further strengthen the relationships with external partners. So the question here is, what partners are we talking about? Is the network the best point of contact for all of them, or is it a mixture? Somewhere the network is best placed to have those relationships, and somewhere it's the firm. And lastly, from a disability network, it should actually say not to further strengthen their relationship, should actually say to conduct an audit of the needs of our people. There's a typo there. So that an audit on the needs of our people around accessibility. And the question there would be, does the network have the time, resources and expertise to do that kind of audit? Or is it best done again by the responsible team in the firm or by external consultants, or a mixture? So this is homework for you to take away. In the pack you receive, you're going to get this slide here with a whole lot of explanation around how to engage with executives in a practical way, including asking the 5 whys, understanding what you need, conducting stakeholder analysis, and then preparing for engagement. So that'll give you a great toolkit. And lastly, just you'll see there's material in there as well around a culture of continuous feedback, where you treat the network as a conduit to provide really crucial feedback to the organization. There's a whole raft of suggestions here and an explanation of how I went about doing that with our network. And then the important bit, including things like how we gathered the feedback, how we collated it and presented it in event reports, for example, that got presented up to senior executives. And then finally, you know, think about, does your network continuously collect feedback? And if it does, is it comprehensive? And then has that feedback then been acted on? If it's not comprehensive, then, you know, can you consider a more comprehensive approach to feedback? If you don't collect feedback continuously, then did you decide not to do that, or did it just happen randomly? Yeah. And depending on whether you think you can challenge that thought and whether there's a conversation that can be had around why you're not collecting feedback. Now, I'm not saying it's right or wrong to collect feedback continuously. You may decide it's not for you and your organization and your network. That's fine. It's just to stimulate your thinking. So that's what we covered today: making your business case, developing a budget, engaging senior management, and then defining the operating agreements. So Sharon, we've got questions, I believe. Just let me know if you would like those to be curated by you, and I will respond.
Yeah, I'll do that. Where do I start? So first of all, participants, did I not say that you were in for a treat? Did I not? I warned you, didn't I? And like I knew he would, David has delivered and then some. I was just sitting behind my screen saying, yeah, that's it, that's right, yeah. So I was cheering you on silently. So thank you so much for such an enriching, practical, and informative presentation, David. There was lots of comments in the chat saying this is great, just what we need. Even one of the fellow panelists said, oh my goodness, this is amazing. So huge thank you. We do have a couple of questions coming through in the Q&A, so let's try and get to those. One of them is anonymous. How do you recommend presenting yourself as a leader in an environment which does not see your identity as one that can lead? So I'm assuming there's a bit of a hierarchical dynamic going on maybe in that organization. And let's take another one, shall we? How do we balance being genuine towards our members and appealing to corporate? And that's from Tristan. So a couple of questions there. Do you want to take those two one after the other?
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. They're fantastic questions. I mean, to start with the one around how do you present yourself as a leader, if your environment doesn't see your identity as one that can lead, it'd be interesting to understand what specific example that might be, because I know, Sharon, you said that might be a hierarchy thing, but I can imagine it also might be on other dimensions too. You know, in some cases, it might simply be the fact that I'm a woman that means I'm assumed not to be able to lead. So it could be hierarchy, it could be identity and so on. I think that there's a couple of thoughts here. I personally would think about something like, who is it in the organization who has power and influence and is someone I can approach, someone I trust, and someone who will help me? Because coming to them and saying, hey, I want to position myself as a leader, I see myself as a leader, but pragmatically, I recognize that I'm probably not perceived as that in this organization. Can you help? And hopefully that person you know and trust who has influence could either help you with some coaching around that, or could help just to kind of sponsor you and create an environment around you where your contributions are recognised. Now, if you feel that you don't have anyone in your organisation you could go to like that, then maybe the place you could start is with someone who's a peer. Someone who you think might at least give you some advice and some moral support and a bit of a chin up when you're feeling a bit down about it, because at least that way you can maintain your mindset, can't you? And when the time is right, perhaps that sponsor type person will come along. There might also be other ways that you can just gently start to steer the firm to broader thinking about what a leader is. Yeah, you might want to have some polite conversations with HR or the learning and development part of your organization and just say, what is our approach to leadership here? How do we define what a leader is? Because if they say, oh, well, a leader is someone who can do X, Y, Z, or is of a certain grade or whatever, you can then start to understand where the organization is coming from. So I hope that makes sense. I know it's a really complex question. It's an excellent question because it also shows that you understand and are reflecting on who you are and how you're showing up. So that's excellent. And for Tristan's question, how do we balance being genuine towards our members of networks whilst appealing to the corporate? And that's a great question. I'll admit I got the balance wrong. So when all that stuff I showed you about Breathe and how great it was, obviously I haven't had time to go into the bits where we hit brick walls, but we did hit a couple. One of them was I think I swung so far the other direction from being internally focused and sort of providing pastoral support that I went wildly into the market, into clients, into the business. And about 18 months into that transformation, I had a rather sad message from someone saying, our network's not fun anymore. You know, the fun's gone. It's all about hard work now. It just feels like it's part of the business. So I would suggest keeping a really close eye on that balance and staying in touch with your members, asking them, are we getting the balance right? Is there too much client related stuff in this network at the moment? Is there enough fun stuff? Is there enough pastoral support? Do we pay enough attention to the needs of our members? And it's just an ongoing dialogue. I don't think I can't tell you from what's quite frankly my bedroom, what you should be doing in your network and how to get the balance right. But you've got to have the dialogue. You've got to talk to people. You've got to ask the question, and that will help steer you in the right direction.
Great. Thank you so much. Wonderful, brilliant question and an equally really helpful answer. So thank you for that, David. And time is fast spent, but I just want to close with Joel McConnell's comment, which I think pretty much sums up what everyone is thinking at this moment, David. And he says, excellent presentation and highly practical guidance on how to really professionalize networks. Thank you for sharing your expertise. So Joel, can I say thank you for putting that, because you really do encapsulate my thoughts and those I'm sure who are watching here today. David, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. I'm not sure if you can stay around for the rest of the conference, but thank you again on behalf of the delegates and Dods. And until we meet again, keep doing the fantastic work to promote and support and help professionalize networks. This is definitely the way to go. So
thank you so much. Again. Thanks, Sharon, and everyone have a wonderful rest of the day. I know you've got lots more treats in store. Dods always does an amazing job and curates such thoughtful and caring events. That's why it's a pleasure and a privilege for me to be part of them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.